Sex work is a really broad topic. It encapsulates a lot of different things. It can range from everything from sometimes strip clubs, cam shows, porn actors, all the way to full body sex work.
Lived experiences will be the key for decriminalizing sex work. Just thinking back to all the other bills that were passed here in Massachusetts, the public accommodations law, those were lived experiences that got that law in place. And I feel like for the Sex Work Decrim, a lot of sex workers still are hesitant to be seen or to be heard, and that goes back to that stigma piece.
So Black and Pink collaborated with another organization called Whose Corner Is It Anyway to start a coalition to decriminalize sex work here in Massachusetts. And it was a really amazing process because what we did was just throw everything that we wanted and the kitchen sink onto a list, and then we really just narrowed it down into what we thought were our priorities. So what we ended up with was the ability to write our own legislation, which was so empowering as we sat in a room of sex workers trying to figure out what the best path for ourselves would be.
We had the hearing for the bill about a month ago now, and I was completely blown away by the bravery of the people who testified and who shared, first of all, their full names, even though, again, we are not at a place where sex work is legal, but also shared their life stories and the many things that they have gone through and the barriers that they have faced because of their chosen profession.
What made me interested in advocating for Sex Work Decrim was actually meeting other sex workers already doing this work. I met amazing people in other spaces where they just felt so empowered and so confident in what they were asking for and laying down a really clear rationale for why. And I have to admit, it didn't make total sense to me at first. Even though I had been a sex worker, I didn't get the full analysis of it. But as I marinated on it more, I really came on board that this was the right thing to do and that the results of decriminalizing sex work would make our entire community healthier and safer. Right now, there's a couple different theories or strategies around decriminalizing sex work.
Legalization, which is what we have currently in Nevada. There is also a form of legalization of sex work in the Netherlands, is a highly state-regulated version of not criminalizing sex workers, but legalization also includes a lot of surveillance of sex workers, mandatory health checkups, a lot of surveillance around who is selling sex and who isn't. One of the things that happened in the Netherlands that people talked about right after legalization was that it actually created a kind of a marginalized segment of people doing sex work. So suddenly there was more attention on immigrant sex workers and undocumented immigrants who were doing sex work. There was more kind of policing of where people were doing sex work.
We have seen from countries that have the Nordic model or the equality model that there are higher incidences of rape, there are higher rates of violence, there's higher rates of abuse. And so, I would not support any model that puts people in danger for doing the job that they choose to perform.
I think full decrim in Massachusetts would give a little glimmer of hope to the trans and BIPOC community. Is just saying, okay, now we have the right to control what we choose to do with our body, and if we choose to engage in survival sex work in general, that we have the right to. So it's like taking back a piece of sense of empowerment. And also, as Massachusetts has been in the transgender movement in the forefront, this will hopefully be a staple point for the rest of the country to start looking at this and start putting the similar bills in order to be passed as law in those states. And this is one of the things that I feel that should be on a federal level.
One thing that I think people may misunderstand about decriminalization is decriminalization doesn't mean that there is a kind of lawless free-for-all when it comes to sex work. What it means is, I think, we can focus on enforcing the laws that are already on the books in a way that's more equitable. I mean, I think it's always good to take away the power of criminalization from the state, especially when that power is rendered unequally. And that is the situation that we're in. So I think that it would be removing an aspect of unequal enforcement of the law, and would make more space for more people to advocate for themselves in the context of how a state like Massachusetts or a country like the US should be governed.
This legislation itself was written by sex workers, and so it's really rooted in their autonomy, in their right for self-determination as a community, to really be able to chart their own path in a way that's going to be the safest, the healthiest, and the most secure for themselves. And all of the research does seem to indicate that full decrim will also reduce trafficking, and is the best way to really support sex workers.
As an advocate, sex work decriminalization would actually enhance us being able to assist current trans sex workers. So for example, right now, if we're working with someone who is currently indulged in sex work, they're going to give us limited information about their well-beings and how they're obtaining the funds and where they're actually, meeting, where is the place they go to for their sex work. Is it walking the streets? Is it online?
It's through the labor rights lens that we're able to really position sex work less as a vice, less as a moral failing of some kind, and just see it as labor. And by doing that, we're able to really empower the worker to be able to advocate for themselves, to get their rights, and to really be able to organize for themselves.
I do think it fits in within that national narrative of having bodily autonomy and of having choice over decisions that relate to yourself. If someone comes to me and they say, I want to participate in sex work, who am I possibly to tell them, no, that's illegal, that decision around your body is unsafe and you should not be allowed to do that?
One of the great things about decriminalization of sex work in New Zealand, as far as I know, is that it has meant sex workers can organize more widely there, that there can be more interface between sex workers' organizations and the government. Sex workers can participate more actively in policies that impact not just sex workers, but also things like urban planning and kind of anti-poverty measures and all kinds of stuff that, right now, at least in our context, it's very difficult to have those perspectives at the table when we're kind of talking about, the way good governance could actually happen. There's a huge constituency of people that we just don't that can't be part of these discussions, and I think should be.
I'm actually thinking too, just during the pandemic, how many people we had who called, again, with unemployment assistance. Well, there's no unemployment assistance if you participate in sex work because, your job is deemed to be illegal and therefore you don't qualify. I mean, we had Uber and Lyft drivers applying for pandemic unemployment assistance. Sex workers, many of whom have families to support, were not granted that same privilege. So we saw a lot of people kind of get pushed further down into poverty during the pandemic, and this is a really good example of how decriminalization would have helped immensely.
So currently, right now, if you are living in a unit paying market rent, and this is a private unit, your landlord can kick you out because he's like, "Oh, you're doing sex work in my apartment, you can be kicked out." So I think this would help in sex workers sustaining an apartment, because it's very hard when, as a sex worker, you don't have a W-2 to show.
One of the things that criminalization does is it makes people invisible as a population to their government. And it's not that people don't know that there are sex workers and they're operating in these places, but it's very hard to make a policy of, say, we want to compensate people for lost livelihood and include sex workers in that kind of policy if the entire group of people, all sex workers are criminalized.
Some of the pushback we always get as legislators is, well, if it doesn't affect the whole Commonwealth, then why are you bothering? And I think it really depends on your perspective of what government is. I think that government essentially has to protect the most vulnerable people. And if we are pushing people off into the shadows, then we're not doing that job.
Let me put it like this. Criminalizing sex work doesn't mean there's less sex work. Criminalizing sex work means that more people have to operate as sex workers without access to the full range of benefits as citizens of whatever country they live in than they would if they could operate within the context of decrim. So in this situation that we're living in the world today, and certainly in the United States, criminalizing sex work just means that you're making life harder for people who are using sex work as a livelihood strategy. And it absolutely includes making people's lives harder with respect to access to healthcare, to information, to condoms.
HIV and AIDS was always in the back of my mind, but the fear of being labeled having HIV is what deterred me from having proper shelter at the time. So for example, when I became homeless here in Boston after leaving an abusive relationship, I tried to go to a women's shelter. And after I disclosed that I was I identified as a transgender woman, the next question out of their mouth was, "How long have you been HIV positive?" So I was already presumed to be HIV positive just because I'm Black and I'm trans. And that made me get up and walk out. And that night was the first night that I indulged in survival sex work. So for me, it's like, when it comes to the cycle of oppression, it's not only with employment, it's with HIV and my health as well.
I think one other part, particularly for street-based sex workers, that most people don't fully realize is that they often don't have a lot of negotiation power, again, because it's criminalized. So if you picture a client pulling up to a spot, there's not a lot of time for back and forth between the sex worker and the client. And so sometimes a sex worker will hop in before really fully knowing what the expectation might be. Or they may feel not empowered to ask for a condom or to use a condom. And so if we were able to decriminalize sex work, there could be a conversation because there would be no impending arrest going to happen. Or sex workers could use online platforms to more fully vet their clients before agreeing to engage in sex.
Because sometimes at 1 o'clock in the morning, where are you going to find condoms and lube? If you don't have any money, you can't go to a 24-hour pharmacy. And so you're going to see this date in order to get funds. So now you're contemplating, am I going to have unprotected sex in order to get these funds? And it's a 50-50 chance that you might go ahead and do it in order to get those funds.
If sex work were decriminalized, Massachusetts, I believe, would see a real burgeoning happen in a lot of marginalized communities. So we'd see the health and safety of sex workers improve. We would see, much like the marijuana industry or when gambling was decriminalized, we would see a lot of the actors that were able to leverage power over sex workers disappear. So much like the mafia kind of had much less of a hand in gambling here in Massachusetts after it was decriminalized, we could also see third-party managers or pimps, etc., lose that leverage that they have over sex workers. and which would only be good for sex workers and increase their health and safety in the short term and the long term?
For me, I would say criminalizing sex work as a former sex worker, a Black trans sex worker, and now an advocate, I would say is very demoralizing. There have been times in my past where I may have, me and my date may have unfortunately interacted with law enforcement, and 9 times out of 10, it was, she tricked me, I didn't know this was a he, she, and the police is looking at me as if I did something wrong, and most times I'm detained and the date is let go. So I feel that it's not a fair playing game. It's just not fair at all. The dates have more rights than we do, especially as a trans sex worker. And then also being berated in the courtroom. So now you're going to court because this date is going to press charges and fool through and saying that you stole his wallet. And now you're in the courtroom and now you're being humiliated in front of a courtroom full of people by the DA and the judge referring to you as he and him, and you're explaining that I identify as trans, but we're going what we see on here as a paper, and it says you're a male, so you're a man. And then hearing the whispers and things like that in the courtroom, that can really traumatize someone. And that didn't make me stop sex work, but what it made me do is do more sex work, but now starting using illegal drugs to cope with that sex work.
I'm glad to see that in the last few years, I think trans sex workers and trans folks who do sex work, trans women in particular, have become more visible within the context of discussions about sex work. When I started my project in the early 2000s, that was not the case. It was very much a discourse that was focused on cis women.
So I think one reason why we focus sometimes on talking about Black and brown trans women in the sex trade is because they're at risk. And we want people to know that some of the most marginalized, vulnerable people are bearing the brunt of these criminalization laws. But that's not to also erase how many other people engage in the sex trade. I know a lot of gay men that engage in the sex trade. I was a gay man that engaged in the sex trade. And I know a lot of others.
One thing that I wish people knew about sex work decriminalization is that it's not only for transgender folks. That we are not the only ones that engage in sex work. Cisgender folks do as well. So I know some people who are still biased towards the trans community and may look at this and like, oh, it's for the trans people. Absolutely not. But no, it's not just for us.
I think the discussion on criminalization in particular has really productively used this idea of kind of a disempowered female sex workers in order to move its agenda forward. And in particularly this image of the kind of helpless, trafficked woman from the global south is something that has been used to generate a lot of support for policies that criminalize sex workers in general.
One thing I wish more people knew about sex work decriminalization is that advocates so deeply care about trafficking. I think that sometimes it can get lost in the conversation that we don't care about trafficking, reducing trafficking, but that couldn't be any further from the truth, as so many of the advocates that I know have also suffered from being trafficked. And the thing that's really most moving and compelling for me is that decriminalizing sex work is a sure path to reducing trafficking. And I feel like that's a nuance that so often gets lost on people. And instead, the conclusion is, so if we decriminalize sex work, trafficking will be unchecked. But that couldn't be more untrue. Research shows that trafficking will be reduced through the decriminalization process.
I wish more people understood that sex work is something that a lot of people do to not only make ends meet, but to have flexibility in their work lives because they enjoy doing it, because it works for them to do it.
So I think people really do need to know that this is driven by people with lived experience, which should be at the heart of all of our policymaking, and unfortunately often isn't.
Decrim has always been a time-sensitive issue. It's long overdue that we decriminalize sex work. We know that people are going to jail for engaging in sex work, for survival sex work, or by choice. And that's ridiculous that somebody would be placed in jail for just trying to survive. And so every day a sex worker goes to jail is a terrible day. And Massachusetts is responsible for that. And so it's always been a time-sensitive issue. And every day we wait is a day that sex workers as a community are disenfranchised.
It would be wonderful to live in a world where sex work was not stigmatized, because not only does it produce harm for sex workers, it also creates a society that itself is based in doing harm to others. So it would be wonderful if people understood that decriminalizing sex work is a necessary and important step toward destigmatizing sex work in general, which would certainly benefit sex workers, but along the way would benefit everybody.
A world that decriminalized sex work looks like a world where sex workers feel empowered, where sex workers' safety needs and health needs are taken care of.
The world that has decriminalized sex work, for me, looks like more trans lives saved, more lives that will not be affected by HIV and AIDS, and more understanding from the general public when it comes to sex work.
If people want to show their support for Decrim, what they can do is call their legislator here in Massachusetts and ask them to support full decriminalization.
Letting them know that you support this and why you support it, whether it's because you have experience as a sex worker or you're a current sex worker, you have a family member or friend that is a current or former sex worker. Just think about the lives that are affected daily without this law being in place, and just really make your voice heard, even on social media. Sharing posts that you see about decriminalizing sex work can be helpful and beneficial.
People can also be bringing these conversations back to their homes, to be having with your families, have them with your friends, have them with your coworkers and your classmates in school where appropriate. And it's by having these conversations that we're also able to destigmatize it. And that's going to be really critical if we really want to get to decrim.